Thanks for tuning in. I'm Scott Walter.
And I'm Michael Watson.
In this episode, we investigate the Center for American Progress, a key cog in the Democratic Party and the Clinton family political machines that is now being rocked by allegations of sexual harassment. Neera Tanden, the group's president, is alleged to have bungled the response to those allegations. This is the InfluenceWatch podcast. One of the latest public institutions to be rocked by allegations of sexual misconduct is a key player in the professional left, the Center for American Progress, or CAP, a think tank founded by John Podesta, a top Democratic operative and Hillary Clinton campaign chairman. In fact, he was reportedly her intended Secretary of State, and an extraterrestrial conspiracy theorist. BuzzFeed reports that a female staffer left CAP after detailing extensive alleged sexual misconduct by one of her managers. That's led to substantial criticism of CAP President Neera Tanden, herself a close ally of the Clintons and reportedly the prospective Health and Human Services Secretary in the Hillary Clinton administration that was to be. Tanden's accused of allegedly bungling the organization's response, including, reportedly, telling an all-staff meeting the former female staffer's name. As the powerful think tank deals with the fallout, we look behind the scenes at CAP and its social welfare media and advocacy arm, and at its ties to other Podesta family organizations. Mike, let's start with the sexual harassment claims that have made the news.
So BuzzFeed, an online news source, has broke, I believe it was last week, that there had been this woman who had, as she was resigning, had put out this letter on the CAP to CAP management saying that one of her managers, a gentleman by the name of Benton Strong, had been sending her extremely inappropriate messages, including at least one alleged solicitation for oral sex. Now, Strong was an associate communication director for the Center for American Progress Action Fund. That's that C4 social welfare advocacy arm.
The think tank is a C3 charity, quote unquote, but it has a C4.
The Center for American Progress does nominally policy research for liberals and for Democrats to advance left-wing policy. The C4, Center for American Progress Action Fund, does media and advocacy that can be more electorally involved, more not technically partisan, but everybody knows it's partisan. So Benton Strong was working in the CAP Action Fund war room. He was a longtime Democratic Party operative. He had worked, I believe he had worked in San Diego. I believe he had worked for the Democratic Party in San Diego. So he was accused of sending these lewd and inappropriate text messages, I believe was BuzzFeed's characterization. And this all came out as Strong was preparing to leave CAP. Inside of this, all was made known to management of CAP while Strong was preparing to leave, and he was preparing to go to Seattle to work for the then mayor Ed Murray, who, in a interesting sideline note, also had to resign because of a sexual misconduct scandal. And this comes out publicly last week when somebody informs BuzzFeed.
Now, we always watch unions carefully in this show. There's a union involved in this story, is there not?
So the Center for American Progress, its staff is unionized. They are members of the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers, AFL-CIO. When the initial allegations were made back in July 2016, the union representatives told management that they thought that the response by management, by Tanden, had not been sufficient. There had not been sufficient training. There had not been sufficient actions taken to counter the what had happened. Apparently, Strong, because he was already leaving when it was made known to management, they just sent him on leave a little bit before he was otherwise scheduled to depart. Allegedly, the city of Seattle and the Mayor Murray's office was not told of the allegations against him until after he had already started work there.
Yep. And was this woman who's at the center of the current controversy, who was Strong's alleged victim, was she the only one that Strong was supposedly harassing at CAP?
No, there are allegedly others. And then, so BuzzFeed breaks the story. Tandon apologizes. There's an all-staff meeting. And at the all-staff meeting, Tandon breaks the sort of number one rule of human resources during a sexual harassment scandal. You do not name the victim, both because it's unfair to the victim, it is unfair, and also it creates potential legal ramifications for disclosing confidential files, especially when there's a collective bargaining agreement involved.
And she's Tandon is alleged to have done this not once but twice in the same meeting, to audible gasps, as I believe the reporting was.
BuzzFeed sources characterized it as audible gasps, and at least one of BuzzFeed sources said that Tandon had, quote, lost the organization today, had lost the confidence of the staff for having made such an egregious error that you would have thought that the left, being so committed to getting sexual misconduct out of the workplace, you would think that they would have known not to do that.
Yes. And then there's been one more step taken by CAP in this continuing scandal, I believe.
Right. They brought in an outside evaluator to look at their policies for dealing with sexual harassment, and then the board of CAP, which includes Podesta, it includes former Senate Democratic leader Tom Daschle, a bunch of other prominent
former Governor Ted Strickland.
Former Governor of Ohio Ted Strickland issued what never brings fear to a sports coach when his ownership tells him that they have a vote of confidence, they have full confidence in leadership. So. Obviously, Tandon remains on as of our discussion. The outside evaluator is supposedly evaluating, but certainly this is being watched with great scrutiny by both the internal actors at CAP and also outside watchdogs.
Yep, I have to throw in one comment about Governor Strickland, who, as you said, on the board of CAP. While he was governor of Ohio, he hired a longtime Democratic operative by the name of Eric McFadden and to head the Ohio Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. This fits into the Podesta and the WikiLeaks stuff. In some of the Podesta leaks, there was Ms. Palmieri, who I believe is still at CAP, was complaining because of conservative Catholics' criticisms of Democrats, and Podesta explained, yes, that's why we've set up our own Catholic groups, and he rattled off Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good and another group that were set up largely with Soros money to advocate in favor of Democrats and left-wing causes. And this particular guy I'm talking about, Eric McFadden, he'd been a spokesman for Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good. He'd been president of Catholics for Faithful Citizenship. He'd been head of Catholics for Kerry in the 2004 election. He was Catholic outreach organizer for Hillary Clinton's 2008 presidential campaign and the rest. And then ends up at Governor Strickland's Office of Faith-Based Initiatives in Ohio until he is arrested and pleads guilty for compelling prostitution of a 17-year-old girl. And apparently, I would add that he may not have been the smartest guy on Craigslist because one of the aliases he used was McFadden Catholic. But that's a sidelight of Podesta.
That's a great way to get yourself caught.
But anyway, let's dig a little deeper into what the Center for American Progress, or CAP, is, And of course, I have put in a plug for our InfluenceWatch.org website, because you can find complete write-ups and thorough documentation of both the CAP, the C3, and CAP Action Fund, the related C4.
And also Ms. Tandon.
Yes, sorry, and Ms. Neera Tandon. The so far as we know at this moment, the president,
as of the beginning of this conversation, the president of CAP.
Yeah.
And CAP Action.
So when did it get started, and what does it do?
So after fairly unexpectedly, the Republicans won the 2002 midterm elections. George W. Bush is president. The Democrats are thinking, okay, well, at least we're going to get the House and Senate back in 2002. However, the Bush administration's response to the attacks of September 11th, the reaction of some of the far left, rallied the Republicans, and the Republicans actually gained seats. This obviously scared the Democrats quite a lot. They wanted to prepare a new infrastructure for the 2004 elections and for future potential Democratic electoral victories. And they looked at what the right had built, specifically the Heritage Foundation, which I believe it was started in the 70s.
I think it might have been the 80s.
No, because it was there when Reagan came in.
Was it already there? Okay, you're right. Of course it was. It was there when Reagan was in, so it was in the 70s.
So it was
You're right.
created
in the 70s.
Created in the 70s, creates a bedrock of policy ideas that when Ronald Reagan then wins the 1980 presidential election and Republicans take the Senate, that Reagan can come into office and say, here are some of the things I want to do. The Heritage Foundation, by the way, continues that role on the right. It has been characterized as Donald Trump's favorite think tank because it had prepared potential policies and trained policy wonk people, the people who then go in and become undersecretaries and become assistant secretaries and become commissioners of federal commissions to then take the policies that they had developed at Heritage Foundation and then put them into practice as government policy. In the early 2000s, the Democrats the Democrats and liberals look at this and they say, that's a good idea, we should copy it. And they create what was originally called the American Majority Institute, but would later become known as the Center for American Progress. People who were there at the beginning, you had obviously John Podesta, you had Democratic politico Terry McAuliffe, later the governor of Virginia, a couple of...
But before that, in between, he would head the Democratic National Committee.
He'd been in the Clinton... I think he had been in the Clinton White House, then he headed the DNC. There had been some controversy about when he was heading the DNC, and then...
exactly, yes. It was always alleged that the idea of selling the Lincoln bedroom at the White House was Mr. McAuliffe's, but...
Although it was never proven. And then on the subject of sleazy ex-Clinton aides, Harold Ickes, and also Clinton political director Don Sosnick. And then they received support from what would ultimately become the sort of Democracy Alliance network of Democratic donors, especially, as you mentioned earlier, George Soros.
Yeah, which was started after the 2004 election, where again the left sort of took the same. I can remember the 2004 election vividly. Even at lunchtime, as the morning exit polls were secretly coming in and being sort of spread around Washington, and Kerry looked to be easily winning. And then, of course, by the end of the night, in fact, again, George W. Bush had beaten the candidate that Mr. Soros had given tens of millions of dollars to, John Kerry, and there was great bitterness between the 2000, 2002, 2004 losses for the Democratic Party. The left decides that the Democratic Party just can't get it done, and we need to have outside the party structures like think tanks and other efforts.
And a lot of, again, a credit to the conservatives of the 1980s and of the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s is that when the Democrats at this, the unions are in retreat. The unions had and still are a principal institutional support of the Democratic Party. As they retreat, the Democrats look to what the conservatives had built in the Heritage Foundation, the the GoPack network that had been built by Newt Gingrich to recruit candidates and support conservative candidates for the House. And the Democrats say we need to copy that.
Yes, they want to build their own infrastructure outside the party,
especially after the worst law of the early 2000s, the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law, meant that your outside rich guys couldn't just give money to the party anymore.
Yes, so they were making it more hard to get money into the party's hands while also deciding that the party was insufficient.
Just couldn't hack it anymore.
Yes.
And then what does CAP serve during the Bush administration? Well, one commentator called it a Hillary Clinton White House in exile, or a White House staff in readiness for President Hillary Clinton. Still was in 2016, the day at noon on November the 8th.
Yes.
When again John Podesta was expected to be was Mike Allen of Axios supposedly got a list of all the people who were going to be considered for Clinton cabinet positions. John Podesta was the bold-faced of three, which presumably meant he had right of first refusal to be Secretary of State, and Neera Tanden was the only listed for Health and Human Services.
And it's worth throwing in there that in the Obama administration, Podesta does come back into government.
Right. Podesta was president of CAP from its founding until the mid-2010s, when President Obama, the Obama White House had kind of gone into struggle. So Obama called Podesta to be counselor to the president, one of the most senior advisors in his White House.
Yep. Now, I do want to say real quick here that there are critics of CAP on the conservative side who claim that CAP didn't precisely grasp that the folks creating CAP and similar places didn't quite grasp the way the conservative infrastructure worked. Conservative infrastructure was not just the left called it a noise machine, and made it sound like, oh, well, it's just they're talking and blathering and all that, and that's not really what's doing it. That's what's doing it. It's not really about the ideas and the policy wonkery. And so certainly CAP was definitely not about heavy-duty, deep-dive research. CAP was about often 3 press releases a day.
One of CAP's most notable public-facing projects is a project of its 501c4 Action Fund, and that is the Think Progress network of blogs, which are quite literally a left-wing noise machine.
Yes.
They are not exactly known for their journalistic rectitude. To use an example from last week, a Think Progress writer or editor, I think a writer on Twitter, who identifies himself as a Think Progress writer on Twitter. New Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has just been sworn in. He went to meet with some foreign governments over the weekend, comes back, is giving his maiden speech to the State Department employees, and the way that always works is like you stand in an escalator and there are some employees behind you, and then of course there's the whole room of employees. And the camera was panning across the employees, and for, again, a few seconds, the way that the camera was framing the visible heads behind Pompeo were all white. We're all white State Department workers. And that earned from a Think Progress writer the statement to the effect that Mike Pompeo was speaking to an all-white meeting of State Department staff, which, if he had waited 45 seconds when the camera panned and there were
other folks visible.
Other folks visible, would have been shown to be entirely false.
Yes. Now, pushing this a bit further, that, as I said, CAP's strategy is far less to do regression analyses comparing economic policies or something like that, rather than just mainly lots of noise. One thing to be noted is that for years and years, if you go to their website and look at the different divisions where they list the employees, the communications department always is larger than any of the other departments like education or energy or economics. But in a way, the capstone of all this is that CAP was the first think tank, left or right, All of them are C3s. We're a think tank. We're a C3. All these C3s, it was the very first C3 think tank to concoct its own C4.
And let's clarify for our audience why that matters. As a 501c3 organization, Capital Research Center is not allowed to say vote for X, is not allowed to say vote against X. We are not allowed to intervene in elections. The Heritage Foundation cannot intervene in elections. Now, that doesn't mean that the Heritage Foundation does not have an ideological valence. It doesn't mean the Capital Research Center doesn't have an ideological valence. But by creating a C4, what CAP and then, because conservatives can do the same thing liberals can do, Heritage ultimately would copy CAP 10 years later. When you have a C4, you can intervene in elections. And that gives Think Progress, the Think Progress blog network, a lot more freedom to talk about things in a way that is likely to impact elections.
Yes, so again, the emphasis on politics, not policy. Well, let's talk about some of the interesting ways that CAP's C3 and its C4 are intimate, shall we say.
So the largest single donor to the Center for American Progress Action Fund is the Center for American Progress. In 2016, the most recent year for which records are available, the Center for American Progress, which is not allowed to engage in which is not allowed to intervene in elections, gave a grant of $3.5 million to the Center for American Progress Action Fund, which can intervene in elections. And that's out of a total CAP action budget of about $8 million. So a little bit less than half of CAP action's budget came from CAP.
And this has been, over the years, this has been a very prominent pattern of the C3 giving millions to the C4. Now, you mentioned that on the conservative side of things, the Heritage Foundation think tank is a C3, and it has a C4.
It has a C4, Heritage Action for America.
As far as we can tell in doing the research for the
based
show,
based on publicly available tax documents in on a 990, the tax return that all tax-exempt organizations, Capital Research Center among them, have to file to the Internal Revenue Service in order to keep exemption from corporate income tax. You have to declare, I gave money to the following other tax-exempt organizations. And so far as we can determine from publicly available 990 documents, Heritage Foundation, 501c3, can't intervene in elections, does not give any money to Heritage Action for America.
Yes, whereas with Center for American Progress, it's year after year after year, millions
millions
and millions of dollars, typically in the range of half, sometimes more than half of the C4's total budget.
Yep.
Now, one thing, for those folks who are autistic enough to really know the hideously complicated C3, C4 laws, some people might think, well, maybe that's because the C3 here, Center for American Progress, is having its C4 lobby for it, because the C3s can do a limited amount of lobbying. Even that rule is complicated.
The maximum amount that applies to CAP is $1 million per year. Lobbying has an extremely technical definition.
Yes.
So they report only using about 70,000 of that. But, and then CAP Action, I think you looked it up, claims zero.
Claims it doesn't do any lobbying, yes.
And that's because lobbying in the IRS rules has an extremely technical definition that basically amounts to meeting with members of Congress or meeting with state legislators.
Or issuing a call to action to the grassroots, like please call your congressman this afternoon
that directly implicates legislators.
Yeah, that grassroots lobbying
ballot
versus
measures.
direct
Again,
lobbying.
this gets very complicated very fast.
Yes. Yeah. So, so that is a very interesting thing that, so far as I know, none of our wonderful adversarial media has ever bothered
to fully explicate how that's supposed to work.
Yes, but well, let's go back for a second here about some of the donors to the.
Well, I mean, I was going. I mean, we can discuss donors. It's all the liberal foundations that we've mentioned in these donor segments before. It's the biggest that we were able to determine using the foundation search service was the foundation of Herb and Marion Sandler, who achieved brief renown in late 2008 when they were shown to have been one of the pioneers of subprime mortgage lending.
Yes, generally considered by left and right among their savings and loan empire was one of the biggest villains in the entire housing crisis.
They were if they didn't invent subprime lending, they made it go big.
They also, it's worth mentioning because there are various Acorn connections to Center for American Progress over the years, they also reputedly used Acorn to harass their competitor, Wells Fargo, in the mortgage business. So that's another thing. And the last, their notoriety's peak, I would say, was when Saturday Night Live, not known to be a right-wing outlet, had actors portray them with the chyron on the bottom of the screen reading "people who should be shot." So yes, they were up to their necks in the whole housing crisis disaster.
They were deeply implicated. But then you have the usual suspects: Rockefeller family foundations, the Open Society foundations associated with George Soros, the Marisla Foundation, which is an environmentalist group, and then the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, among many others.
As well as some of our favorite unions that we discuss virtually every show. SEIU, the nation's largest organized political donor for every single cycle. Well, I mean, counting all the cycles from 1990 to 2016.
The largest over all the years.
Yes, so from 1990 to 2016, the largest political donor in America. Also, the American Federation of Teachers, the AFL-CIO, have funded both CAP and CAP Action, the C3 and C4 sides. Well, we should also talk, speaking of Center for American Progress, so let's also look at the Podesta family, which have been so important in its
and been
life.
in the news recently, because John has a brother, and his brother is Tony, who is John's former business partner. They together founded Podesta Associates, which would later become and is better known as the Podesta Group, one of the biggest lobbying firms until recently.
Until it shuttered its doors just days ago, the 8th largest lobbying firm in D.C.
Yeah, it closed up shop late last year, and it was one of the largest lobbying firms in Washington, D.C. Tony had previously been married to Heather Miller Podesta, who is in her own right a Democratic super lobbyist, had a separate lobbying firm. Tony Podesta and Heather Miller, when they were married, had multiple properties, a massive art collection legendary to the Washington, D.C. political world.
Legendary wine cellar of thousands of bottles.
They divorced, I think, in 2014.
I think that's right.
Yeah. And then to get an idea of the scale just of the lobbying revenue, again, lobbying has a very technical definition. So a public affairs firm like the Podesta Group not only would have lobbying revenue, it would also have communications revenue and consulting revenue. Just the lobbying revenue that is reported in 2015 was $30 million annually.
Yeah, and we should add that interestingly, that's in the neighborhood of Center for American Progress's
annual budget. Yeah,
tens of millions of dollars for that as well.
They're in the tens. And in a more sort of nakedly political sense, the Podesta couple were big-time Democratic bundlers who would gather together all their rich friends who would then write checks to Barack Obama's re-election campaign.
Or Hillary Clinton's.
Campaigns for whatever.
Yep. Now, however, speaking of Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016, after she lost under John Podesta's direction as leader of her campaign, things did not go well for Tony and the Podesta lobbying group.
Yeah, I think things fairly immediately go sideways once the government starts investigating the Russian interference in American politics over the past decade. Though viewers may be familiar with the allegations against Paul Manafort, who had managed the Trump campaign for a couple months, after having represented some entity called the European Center for a Modern Ukraine, which was a front group for the Russian-backed former government of Ukraine. When the special prosecutor released an indictment charging that in order to cover his tracks, Manafort had engaged in a bunch of financial crimes. It was announced that his lobbying for the European Center for Modern Ukraine, read the former Ukrainian government backed by the Russians, had engaged two Washington, D.C. public affairs firms other than Manafort's. The Company A, which turned out to be some Republican lobbying firm, and Company B. And it was fairly easy to recognize that Company B was the Podesta Group, which was chaired by Tony Podesta.
So after Mr. Tony Podesta recently had his usual big lavish birthday party for himself at his Colorama neighborhood mansion.
For those who are not familiar with the economic geography of Washington, D.C., Colorama is the ritziest neighborhood where President Obama's Washington, D.C. home is.
Yes, where he retired to after sticking up for the little guy. But very soon after this Manafort information comes out, all of a sudden the Podesta Group is closing its doors.
The Podesta Group fairly immediately closes in late 2017.
Now, and according to the Washington Post's reporting on this, it didn't close. Tony told his ex-employees, who probably are not retiring to Colorama mansions and vast wine cellars.
May still need continued employment, yes.
Yes. Those folks are told that this is not because they are Company B and Mr. Mueller may be sending unpleasant pieces of paper to them, but he gave a different excuse.
Yeah, he just couldn't stand up to the scrutiny of Fox News.
Yes, Fox News was being mean to him, and so his tens of millions of dollars operation
which makes one wonder what Tony Podesta thought he was being paid, the tens of millions of dollars. Why his services were quite so expensive? Because one of the things, as a recovering public relations professional, one of the things that you have to deal with as a public relations professional in Washington, D.C. is media scrutiny.
Yes. But now we've talked a bit about the Podesta Group and the Center for American Progress. Have these two streams ever crossed historically?
So to tell this story, we have to go back to late 2012 when we discussed a couple of episodes ago when we had American Legislative Exchange Council's Bill Meyerling on about the left-wing campaign to get make nonprofits say who funded them, make nonprofits say who is giving them money. And the idea, of course, for the left is that they can then send the
SCIU
goons. They can then send the SCIU toughs to go make life miserable for them. So,
which, by the way, has happened for things like the Washington State conservative think tank Freedom Foundation.
Right. This is not a hypothetical thing that could happen. But obviously, conservatives said, "Hey, wait a minute. Your nonprofits aren't disclosing their donors. Why should we?" So that led to pressure on CAP to disclose its donors, which they then did. And lo and behold, a number of CAP corporation donors were also Podesta Group clients.
Really?
Perhaps the most sort of nakedly sleazy was Walmart, which, when they were debating Obamacare, one of the provisions was the employer mandate, which would require employers above a fairly small level to provide employer-provided health care, employer-provided health insurance. Obviously, Walmart is one of, if not the largest private sector employer in the United States, and they would like to make it harder for their competition by making them provide health insurance, that it's easier for Walmart over hundreds of stores and dozens of cities to amortize across their operation. That would make it for a small mom and pop shop much, much harder to deal with. So, with the support of Center for American Progress and Walmart, put out a letter saying the employer mandate's a good idea. We like this. This is good and liberal and helps the little guy and doesn't in any way help Walmart's ultimate bottom line. All the while, Walmart was hiring Podesta Group to lobby for, among other things, the employer mandate.
Yes, shocking. Well, the Center for American Progress, though, as we say, doesn't just help some of its big corporate donors and foundation donors. It also is happy to help its it's well, sorry, it isn't just a function of lobbying group and corporation and supposed think tank. Sometimes it's also lobbying group and supposed think tank and government administration officials. So back, one of the last story that I want to tell is the Obama administration, of course, was notorious for encouraging vast sums of tax dollars to be given to various green energy subsidies, which often helped both foundations. So the Solyndra scandal actually was a foundation scandal, not a corporate scandal, because the company was actually owned by a foundation of a left-wing oil billionaire,
and also crony. Also crony capitalists with ties to all of this network that we discussed earlier.
Exactly.
Terry McAuliffe had a who we mentioned earlier is one of the brainchilds behind CAP. Had a electric vehicle company that did it ever produce a car?
I don't think they actually made a car, sadly. And by the way, we should throw in there, of course, and his partner in that company was Hillary Rodham's brother. But anyway, so you have back in the Obama administration, there are these massive green subsidies, especially for wind and solar, which can only function with massive government subsidies and otherwise are a disaster. Well, there was a famous study, I'm sure listeners, some will remember, the Spanish government, which had poured many millions of its taxpayers' dollars into subsidies for wind power, actually did a study and discovered that it was a disaster and that for every job that was created in the wind power sector, more than 2 jobs were destroyed elsewhere. So that's probably not what you call a fine return on your investment, especially if you happen to be, a guy who needs a job. But anyway, the study was being, by the Spanish government, was being talked about a great deal in D.C., and there was a great terror on the part of the trade group for the wind energy companies, which relies, we say, on those heavy government subsidies. They were very distressed, so they connected up with their friends at the Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and there were FOIA requests from our friends at the Competitive Enterprise Institute that dug these emails out. So in the emails, the trade group is screaming at the quote-unquote scientists working for the government to say, you've got to attack this study because it could ruin the chances for the Congress renewing
Right. All of a
subsidies.
sudden, Congress will say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't what we signed up for.
So, and of course, the scientists were quite happy to oblige, and they did it in a very timely fashion because they were being whipped about, there are votes coming up in Congress to send the money our way, so you better hurry up with this. So they did, and the emails also show that they coordinated, of course, with the Center for American Progress, whose noise machine was happy to put its wind, shall we say, behind the wind subsidies. Although the taxpayers of America will be happy to know in this instance, it actually failed. Congress did not renew the subsidies at that time.
That is stunning.
So it actually didn't work. So once again, science, quote unquote, was defeated, but the taxpayers probably were better off for it. Well, any last minute thoughts on the big picture? This is all classic examples of how influence
right. This is
works.
a classic story. The story of CAP is the classic story of influence, as you said. The out of power party in the Bush administration creates a think tank to develop its program of government, basically a program of government, and to advocate. And I think your characterization that whereas the conservative think tank institutions, American Enterprise Institute, and Heritage Foundation broadly, tend to be more research than communications, I think it is reasonable to say that CAP is more communications than research. That to create their program of government, advocate for their program of government, and then once they are ultimately in government, in the Obama administration, to defend that program of, enact and defend that program of government, in the manner that you said, basically go pharma study to counter the other study.
To make sure that
To
vote in Congress
to make sure the vote in
goes
Congress goes the way that the trade association of all your friends goes the way you want it to go. Although, and again, you wonder how they and those trade group relationships, those corporate relationships. CAP has been accused by lefties of modifying its results to service its donors. Obviously, CAP denies this because that would destroy its credibility if it were true. But lefties have accused them of
pay for play.
Yeah, of what is called pay for play, which is where your donor says, "I'm really, really interested in this issue." You know what that donor wants to see, and you give it to them. So there's some question, now that some of the corporate relationships might be a little bit harder to reach because it won't be Tony Podesta picking up the phone and calling John and saying, "Hey, we need to, hey John, help."
Yes, be interesting to see how the revenues work out. Although in the current climate, revenues for the left are awfully good.
It is, as an influence institution, whether you're a media property or a think tank. Being in opposition is
always the best. Yes, much easier to. Fear and anger are the great motivators.
Fear and anger are the great motivators.
And if your side is out of power, there's no shortage
they're
of
always
fear
afraid.
and anger. Thanks so much, Mike. That is our show for this week. If you're listening to this on iTunes or Stitcher, know that we broadcast a live video version of this podcast at 10 a.m. on Thursdays on Facebook Live and YouTube. You can find our pages by searching Capital Research Center. And if you're watching the video version, we encourage you to subscribe to the audio on your preferred podcast platform. We'll see you next week.